I'd like to thank Governor Dayton for the budget that protects property taxpayers and Minnesota communities and a bipartisan opportunity emerging to meet the goals of the state of Minnesota. Governor Dayton's budget protects local government aid funding and is sincere and committed to holding the line on property taxes, a goal that should spur bipartisan effort to make affordable and vibrant communities a reality. We believe that rural Republicans whose communities rely on LGA to stay strong and competitive, and we'll be able to work with Governor Dayton and their leadership to forge a budget agreement to protect property taxes in cities across the state. And here's why it's so important. The local property taxes have risen $3 billion in the past years. That's over a 68% increase in property taxes. Our constituents and our property taxes and our voters can no longer do this while their jobs are frozen, they're losing their jobs, and the market value is going down. So we need to stay strong and keep our property taxes down. At this time, I'd like to introduce Nancy Carroll.
I am president of the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities this year, and I can't stress enough how critical it is that we continue to have the support of local government aid for our cities. In Park Rapids, we have repeatedly delayed our capital improvement projects. As one example of what we have done with reduced funding from the state, and we have also deferred any street maintenance. We are a tourism community. I'm sure many of you have come to visit us, and we have a high priority of making sure that we look good for the tourists. Large part of our economy relies on it, but we are really stuck with reduced funding. With a $6 billion budget deficit, there's no question of whether taxes will be going up. The question is, which taxes? Minnesotans have had it with the state continually doing a bait and switch every time it has a budget shortfall, pushing the responsibility time and again onto the local taxpayers. I guess I'm back to you, Bruce.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce to you Minneapolis Mayor R.T. Rybak.
Thank you. These are tough times, and in tough times, everyone has to sacrifice. Taxes will go up in Minnesota. It's only a question of whether property taxes will continue to rise disproportionately, and working class Minnesota will continue to have challenges staying in their homes. The mayors up here have come together across party and geography. The radical cuts to local government aid have been a match.com for mayors around the state. We have a good partnership. But more important, there seems to be a bipartisan consensus arising that property taxes have been allowed to go too high, that the state should no longer make radical cuts to a long-standing successful program to keep property taxes down. So we stand together to say we support what Governor Dayton has done in the budget. We are encouraged by the early signs that there is an emerging consensus across geography and party that we need to continue to do more to keep property taxes down. Every mayor in Minnesota has to do a budget. Our job is to cut spending as much as we can to make sure that we hold the line on property taxes, but we also have the responsibility for putting police officers and firefighters on the streets and for paving those streets and plowing those streets. Minnesotans recognize we provide direct basic services, and I think Minnesotans increasingly recognize that the state's partnership in doing that and keeping property taxes down has to be renewed. Thank you.
Oh, and this is your city.
I'm in foreign territory here.
Oh. Mayor Chris Coleman, St. Paul.
Thanks, Bruce. Good afternoon, everyone. Mayor Rybak and I last week were in a meeting in the governor's office with the Secretary of Commerce, who was in town to talk about how cities could get more involved in the export business. But before the meeting began, both of us turned to each other and we looked at each other and said, wow, this is really weird. And what was weird about it was, for the first time in my 6 years in office and for the first time in Mayor Rybak's near 10 years in office, we were in the governor's office with a governor who was truly our partner. A governor that understood what happened in cities across the state of Minnesota, with a governor that understood that the strength of Minnesota is dependent upon the strength of our cities across Minnesota, that understood that to cut local government aid meant to increase property taxes, diminish services in our communities, diminish our ability to provide public safety, diminish our ability to provide for educational opportunities for our children, and a true partner that has, from the very beginning of his campaign, said very clearly what his priorities were going to be, understood the partnership with cities, and said, I'm going to protect what we have, so come to expect in the state of Minnesota in terms of a quality of life. Governor Dayton has delivered on the promise of his campaign. He's delivered on his years of understanding of what makes Minnesota strong, and he has delivered on his clear understanding that in order for Minnesota to be strong, Minnesota cities have to be strong. This budget's honest. This budget deals fairly with the challenges that the state of Minnesota faces. It's a tough one. There are a lot of people that are going to be challenged by it. But the fact of the matter is, if Minnesota is going to continue to be at the top of many, many different standards of life, quality of life, if we're going to continue to push this regional economic development strategy that Mayor Rybak and I and others have been so engaged in, we have got to make sure that our cities are standing tall, they're standing strong, and they're not continually pushing the cuts of the state down onto the local property taxpayers. That's what this budget does. It's not easy. There are a lot of challenges. This is a huge budget deficit that the state faces. But at least one party, at least one person has put forward a budget. It's easy to stand back and criticize. It's easy to say what you don't like. But Governor Dayton has put forth a budget that balances the budget going into the future and protects cities and protects property taxpayers across the state of Minnesota. I personally want to applaud Governor Dayton. I want to thank him for his efforts. I know that there's going to be a lot of discussion in the months ahead, but I hope that we understand and protect the core principles and values that are espoused in this budget that the governor has put forward. As mayors, we stand with the governor in his support for local cities across this state. It's bipartisan, as Mayor Rybak suggested. We have Democrat, we have Republican, we have agnostic. We have the spectrum. But we stand firm and we stand together in our belief that Minnesota is strongest when our communities are strongest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. At this point in time, we can take questions.
So are you folks all endorsing the entire Dayton budget plan, including his tax the rich part of it?
I endorse Governor Dayton's plan, but the entire organization has other ideas, and some prefer sales tax and others prefer raising general revenue, and but most, if not all, do not like the regressive upping property taxes, regressive property taxes.
You're talking about the coalition when you're saying some prefer.
I'm talking about the coalition, and there's a lot of mayors that I talk to that are not in the coalition. So the whole spectrum of the state of Minnesota, pretty much.
So Minnesota mayors are not together on how you get the money to keep LGA coming. Is that accurate?
Well, I think their minds are open, and they're hoping that some sort of coalition can form between the Republicans and the Democrats and the governor to fix this tax problem.
Mayor, have you found any rural Republicans in the legislature who support your position?
I know that I've spoken to some, and we continue to have a dialogue with the rural Republicans and others about the local government aid and the property taxes and the budget. And there is growing support out there that I can see.
Mayor, the governor has acknowledged that his budget as he presented it is not going to become law as it stands. And he said everything is negotiable. I hope Andrea's here. I hope I'm paraphrasing him correctly. Are you folks worried that that perhaps LGA, that the governor will waver on that position, or maybe that's not the way of saying it, but in the budget negotiation process that there will ultimately end up being some LGA cuts?
Well, that's a real good question, and it's really difficult to answer because I know that the cities have taken a much bigger cut than the counties and other units of government. So we've done our part. We continue to do our part. You've heard the other mayors and people talk about that. And I don't think that we've ever said that we're not going to do our part. In our part, we just want to make sure that it's across the board and fair. And I would hope that because we've taken such deep cuts in the past that others have not, that we don't have to take as deep of cuts, and the governor does remain strong with local government aid.
So you're expecting to take some cuts when all is said and done?
You know, I guess there's expectations and then there's reality, and that's what you have to weigh.
What's your view of the possibility of switching to a local option sales tax in lieu of LGA?
That's been discussed with a lot of people, and I think for some communities, it would, local option sales taxes would do very well. On the other hand, you have Cohasset's of the world that really would gain nothing from it and rely on local government aid. Cohasset's a small town by Grand Rapids that would probably go broke if they relied on a local option sales tax because they could not raise enough revenue. Sure.
I want to step in on that one, because look, the city of St. Paul sends up $200 million in sales taxes up to the state of Minnesota. We send up another $50 million approximately in business property taxes. So one of the things I wanted to debunk is this idea that somehow this is just government welfare for cities across the state of Minnesota. We send up a huge portion of the state's budget in revenues that are derived in our communities. Some are more challenged because they're smaller towns. They're not government. They're not community centers or regional centers. But the fact of the matter is, you want to talk local options. My option would be, let's keep what we kill in the city of St. Paul and let's start sharing a little bit of that. So this idea that we can send up hundreds of millions of dollars from St. Paul, hundreds of millions of dollars from Minneapolis, hundreds of millions of dollars from across the state, and somehow getting a little small portion of that back is unfair, is absurd. We have needs, we have obligations. We need this partnership. If nothing else, whether you agree with the strategy that the governor has or anything else, it at least expresses a partnership between cities and the state of Minnesota, and it at least expresses a governor that understands what it is, in fact, that we do in cities across this state.
Mayor Wilson and Mayor.
Let me add on to that. I think Chris raised a great point. Minneapolis sends $90 million in business property taxes, $385 million in sales taxes. If we blew up the LGA program and let us keep our business property tax or let us keep our sales tax, we would be dramatically ahead. But what's important to say is that the local government aid is about having consistent quality services across all of Minnesota. Megan and I took a drive out to Montevideo weekend ago and went through one small town after the other. Not every town in the state of Minnesota has the option that a Minneapolis or a St. Paul has. It is very much in the interest of every single Minnesotan to make sure that there's good police in each of those towns, that there are good roads in each of those towns, and we all benefit from all of them. The philosophy we should have in tough times is in tough times people come together. Minnesota should come together, and as mayors we come together to say every community, regardless of what strength they happen to have within their boundaries, is part of one Minnesota.
Have any of the greater Minnesota mayors received positive signals from Republican legislators in your area that they could support the governor's plan for LGA?
I think right now, I think our legislators are probably still open to conversation from what it sounds to me in the conversations I've had. But, you know, I want to talk a little bit about LGA and this tax thing. I'll give you an example. About a third of our budget is from local government aid. Our whole general fund's about $3.2 million, so we get about $1.1 million. But realize that local government aid is also our sales tax and our income tax. And while we have a fairly viable community, if all of the sales tax that we would spend would be taken by maybe the Minneapolis or the St. Paul, you know, that system doesn't really play out as evenly as people would think. So I look at this whole thing as a package or a portfolio of revenue that allows us to provide adequate services. And yes?
Do voters understand the correlation between property taxes going up and no new taxes? Because they seem to vote no new taxes all the time.
And you know what? I sometimes wonder if they do see that correlation. And unfortunately, I don't know if we're all as engaged as we should be in budget talks. You try to be as open and you try to do everything you can, but the answer to your question is no. I don't think all of them see that correlation. I think they assume, well, just don't raise property taxes. And yet, you know, when we have a huge snowfall like we've had now, they do hope to go to work right on time. And so that's, I sometimes think, the part they don't put the two pieces together appropriately.
But keep in mind, you know, the voters went to the booth last fall, and well over 50% of them voted for a candidate that specifically called for tax increases. One on the highest income earners in Minnesota, one on clothing and other sales taxes. So this idea that the Minnesota voters are only, will only vote against raising taxes is inconsistent with what we just saw. It's inconsistent with polls. It's easy, of course, for people to say, well, tax somebody else, but the vast majority of Minnesotans do support an increase or equalization of rates across all taxpayers, including the wealthiest earners in the state of Minnesota. So it's more complicated than that. But to your point, I do think that I think it's one of the reasons why we saw a disproportionate share of the budget fix in the state of Minnesota over the last several years was cut to local government aid, because up here, the responsibility fell on all of us on the local level, and it was a little bit more obscure as to who was actually responsible for those taxes going up. But this idea, and again, it was just exemplified. If property taxes in Glencoe can go from $5,000 to $9,000 in a span of a couple of years, somebody's paying the bill. And this idea that we can just get away without anybody having additional expenses is just not true. This is a tough situation, but let's be honest about it.
Okay, show of hands, folks. If the Dayton LGA package would go through, how many of your cities would not raise property taxes?
If we could also get the pension reform that we're seeking, we would not do that.
Did anybody not raise your hand?
I don't know.
Don, we had a 0% increase in the keep on going back and forth here. We in 2011, the budget that was adopted and passed by the city of St. Paul last year was a 0% increase in the levy, a 0% increase in business fees in the city of St. Paul, but it was dependent upon the partnership between the city and the state of Minnesota. That has been, in my conversations with some of the Republican legislators, questioned. But to do anything else would have been to speculatively raise taxes or conversely laid people off. We based our budget in 2011 the same way that we have always done it, on certified numbers and on estimates of what we were going to collect in property taxes. Because of that, we were able to hold the levy at zero, business increases, fees increases to zero, and we will continue to do that. So I can absolutely guarantee you, because that's what we based our budget on.
Thank you very much for coming.
I was just going to say, we work closely with our team, actually hired them for this.